If someone told you your family could disappear from your life for 10 years and still show up one morning expecting a place to stay, would you believe them? I wouldn't have until it happened to me. And the moment I opened that door changed everything I thought I knew about loyalty, blood, and survival. My name is Caroline West. I'm 38 years old. And for the past 10 years, my life hasn't included Sunday dinners, birthday calls, or even the kind of awkward holiday texts people send out of obligation. Silence became my safest language. Routine became the only thing that made sense. These days, I run a small batch dessert business out of a rented commercial kitchen on the north side of Portland, Oregon. Cakes, tarts, pastries, whatever kept the ovens warm, and my thoughts steady. Then, last month, everything shifted. A food critic featured my midnight caramel pie, and overnight, the business blew open. Orders stacked faster than I could bake, and suddenly, the numbers whispered something I had never once allowed myself to imagine. I could finally move. And not just across town upward. So I bought a house, a real one, bigger than anything I grew up in, bigger than anything I ever believed someone like me would own. The kitchen felt like a promise I had waited my whole life to keep. The extra rooms felt like possibilities I hadn't named yet. I moved in with a folding chair, 3 boxes of bakery supplies, and a leftover lemon loaf. No furniture, no photos, no trace of the girl I used to be. That first night, the house felt calm, almost protective. But the next morning, the past found me. Literally. 10 years without a word. And suddenly, my family was standing on my porch in the cold Portland drizzle, looking at me like the distance between us was nothing more than a long weekend. They brought luggage, assumptions, and that familiar air, the belief that no matter how far I'd gone, they still owned a piece of me. What happened when I opened the door is the reason I'm telling this story. But before I take you inside that moment, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? I want to see how far this story travels. Patterns start early in a family, long before anyone recognizes them. For me, it began years before I understood what it meant to be the oldest child. Responsibility wasn't taught, it was assigned by the rhythm of our household. At 16, I worked shifts at a roadside cafe, brought home tips, and filled whatever gaps appeared in the budget. No one told me to. It was simply clear who was expected to hold things together. My younger sister, Lena West, grew up under a different kind of sky. Adults called it sweetness, gentleness. What they meant was, she never had to explain anything. A scraped knee earned her soothing words. A missed assignment earned her sympathy. A bad decision earned her protection. And the rest of us quietly adjusted our lives around her. My mother's constant worry wrapped itself around Lena like a shield. If Lena felt tired, we all fell silent. If she felt stressed, every plan shifted. And I learned exactly where I belonged. If Lena cried, the entire household shifted itself around the sound. I didn't resent her back then. I just adapted the way an oldest child learns to quietly and completely. I handled rides, chores, errands, anything that kept tension from snapping in the air. What I couldn't adapt to was the slow shift in how I was seen. It didn't happen overnight. It leaned gradually, the way a bookshelf sags after years of weight on the wrong side. A missing wallet meant my name was the first one called. A forgotten appointment turned into the assumption that I hadn't passed along the message. Even when I tried to clarify small misunderstandings, my mother's expression would tighten, this subtle, exhausted look that told me I was making things harder instead of helping. The moment everything crystallized came on a warm August afternoon. Lena misplaced a small envelope of cash she had saved for a school field trip. It wasn't much, barely gas station snack money, but the reaction it triggered shifted something no one acknowledged. She stood in the kitchen, tears balanced at the edges of her eyelashes, breathing in these tiny, uneven bursts. Her palms were open, lifted slightly, as if asking the world why it was being unfair to her. I said I hadn't touched her money. I said it clearly, calmly. But the room didn't tilt toward logic. It tilted toward emotion, hers. No one yelled, no one accused, but the disappointment that settled into the space between us said enough. It felt as though I'd failed some expectation that had never been spoken aloud. That was the day I understood that explanations didn't matter in a house where feelings held more authority than facts. There was no manipulation in Lena's face, just the quiet certainty of someone who had learned that softness could move mountains. After that, the rhythm of the household settled into a pattern I couldn't influence. If Lena had a late project, it must have been because I didn't remind her. If she missed the bus, I must have taken too long getting ready. If she seemed anxious, it must have been because I hadn't supported her well enough. None of it was said directly, but unspoken expectations can carve deeper scars than words ever could. I retreated into work because work was clean. A shift began. A shift ended. Effort made sense there. Home didn't. At home, every attempt to correct a false assumption only deepened the narrative, so eventually I surrendered to silence. The less I resisted, the smoother life ran. And that was the real beginning of the distance, not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet erosion that settles in the corners of a house unnoticed. There comes a moment when a family pattern stops being invisible and becomes a weight you can no longer carry. For me, that moment arrived on a cold Portland morning, when the balance finally tipped beyond anything I could repair. I had agreed to lend my old sedan to Lena West so she could run a quick errand before school. It wasn't the first time she'd used it, but it was the first time she returned with the front bumper pushed inward and a long silver scrape slicing across the paint. She walked into the house trembling, clutching her jacket as if something catastrophic had happened to her, rather than to the car. By the time I stepped into the kitchen, the story had already taken shape, not detailed, not factual, but arranged perfectly within the emotional logic everyone had always granted her. I heard my name spoken in that tone again, the familiar one that implied I was somehow responsible for events I hadn't even been present for. There was no space to ask questions, no room to offer clarity. The conclusion was settled before I opened my mouth. I stood there, realizing, with a quiet ache, that truth had no seat at the table in the version of reality everyone was more comfortable believing. After that morning, the shift became unavoidable. Holidays passed without my input. Plans were made, gatherings arranged, group photos posted, none of which included me. It wasn't a dramatic exile. It was softer than that, subtler. I didn't get pushed out. I slipped out as the doorway kept inching farther than I could reach. I tried to stay connected. I tried to explain. But every attempt only deepened the distance, as though defending myself confirmed whatever people already believed. Eventually, I stopped trying altogether. I packed the few things I owned and moved into a small studio apartment on the other side of Portland. I told myself the space would help us reset, that a pause would allow everyone to see the situation clearly. But distance didn't soften anything. It hardened it. I became the sister who pulled away, who chose her own path, who complicated everything. It didn't matter that none of it was true. Truth had stopped being a shared language long before I had realized it. 10 years is a long time to live outside the orbit of people who once shaped your entire world. During those years, I worked any job that kept the lights on. I brewed coffee at dawn, cleaned offices long after sunset, and learned the science of batter alone in industrial kitchens when the rest of the city slept. Work made sense. It didn't shift beneath my feet. Effort became results. Results became progress. Meanwhile, Lena built her own mythology online. I didn't see it at first. I wasn't connected to anyone's accounts. But Portland is a small city, and stories travel fast, especially the dramatic ones. She posted cryptic lines about betrayal, healing, and being abandoned by people who couldn't handle her light. She wrote about loving deeply and being hurt deeply. She never typed my name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew exactly who she meant. It was surreal watching distant relatives gather around Lena's online narrative like moths to a soft, sympathetic glow. They commented with prayers, sent her encouragement, reminded her publicly that family should forgive, and reshared her posts with captions about resilience. Their messages drifted back to me through acquaintances, never directly, always sideways, like smoke slipping under a door. It became obvious they had created their own version of me. A flat silhouette built from assumptions and half-heard retellings, a version much easier to accept than the complicated, evolving person I was actually becoming. With each passing year, the distance stopped feeling like an accident and settled into something permanent. Birthdays passed without a text. My mother changed her number without telling me. Cousins got married and stood in group photos I never knew were taken, celebrating events I was never invited to witness. I heard, through someone who hadn't meant to tell me, that I was mentioned in a wedding speech as the sister who lost her way. I didn't correct it. I no longer had the energy to revise stories people were committed to believing. Silence eventually grew into its own ecosystem, predictable, quiet, strangely efficient. Within that silence, I began building a life that wasn't defined by their absence, but by my own persistence. Growth doesn't announce itself. It sneaks in through small victories that only reveal their meaning when you look back. My turning point began in a rented corner of a shared kitchen on the east side of Portland. I chose the late-night slot because it was cheap and because no one else wanted it. Those hours became my sanctuary. I burned through batches, experimented with flavors, and failed privately without anyone hovering nearby. Orders started small: 5 boxes of cookies for a coworker, 7 for a neighbor's office. I measured progress not by profit, but by restocking flour more often, replacing whisks bent from overuse, and the way the oven breathed heat onto my face just before sunrise. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And steady, after years of emotional turbulence, felt like oxygen. The shift from hobby to business happened when a local tech office placed a bulk order for a corporate event. It wasn't huge, but it demanded more precision than anything I'd done before. I spent that week whisking until my fingers cramped, timing every tray to the second, and labeling each box with almost obsessive care. The feedback was immediate. The office called again the next month, then again 2 weeks later. Word slipped through Portland's small business networks quietly at first, then louder. Orders doubled, then tripled. I upgraded to larger mixing bowls, sturdier containers, and a second set of pans to avoid washing between batches. I tracked expenses in a worn notebook, calculating reinvestment, learning when to take risks. Eventually, the shared kitchen shrank around me. I needed more refrigeration, more storage, more room to breathe. Renting my own dedicated space felt terrifying, but it was the first choice I made that felt like true faith in myself. The new kitchen I rented was small and industrial, tucked between an auto repair shop and a steel storage warehouse on the north side of Portland. It carried the faint smell of metal and detergent, but during the hours it belonged to me, it felt like possibility. With more room to work, orders climbed quickly. I expanded my menu to include bars, cakes, and custom desserts. Deliveries required pre-dawn wake-ups, midday restocks, and long evenings with the mixers humming like machinery in a factory. For the first time in my life, exhaustion felt purposeful instead of draining. The numbers suggested something I had never experienced before: stability. Not wealth, not luxury, just the kind of predictable income that allowed breathing room. When I hired my first part-time helper, a quiet college student who handled labeling and packaging, the workload shifted from overwhelming to manageable. The business no longer depended entirely on my 2 hands. It had rhythm, structure, and potential. I documented everything: ingredient quantities, cost fluctuations, flavor feedback. Each batch became progress, even when the results weren't perfect. The true turning point arrived when a regional cafe chain reached out after sampling one of my dessert bars at a networking event. They requested weekly deliveries across several locations. The scale intimidated me, but the opportunity was undeniable. After negotiating a schedule that wouldn't compromise quality, I accepted. That contract brought enough consistency for me to imagine long-term possibilities I had once dismissed as unrealistic. I saved carefully, trimmed unnecessary expenses, and resisted expanding faster than my foundation could support. Each steady month brought me closer to something solid, something that felt like a life built on my own terms. Eventually, stability brought me to a milestone I never thought I'd reach: homeownership. When I toured the house I would later buy, I didn't see extravagance. I saw usable counter space, a living room that could host small team meetings, and spare rooms that could become storage or calm corners of quiet. Signing the papers felt surreal, not because of the house itself, but because of the years it had taken to reach that threshold. I had lived there only a short time, still adjusting to the peaceful stillness, when tires crunching on gravel broke my morning routine. Movement on the security camera made my stomach tighten. Two figures stepped out of a car with casual familiarity. One dragged a suitcase. The other scanned my porch with entitlement. Seeing them on my screen after 10 years felt unreal. Lena West, my younger sister, moved with that practiced confidence she had perfected long before adulthood, the kind born from believing rules applied to everyone but her. Beside her stood Evelyn West, my mother, gripping her sweater like she expected the house to welcome her back. Neither of them looked uncertain. Neither hesitated. They walked up my porch as though answering an invitation no one had sent, certain, unbothered, and absolutely convinced that history would rearrange itself for their convenience. I didn't rush to the door. I watched them on the security feed longer than necessary, long enough to recognize every familiar tilt of their shoulders, every assumption in their posture. They fully expected the years of distance to fold the second I appeared. But instead of shrinking, something in me steadied. I walked to the entryway table, picked up the folder I had prepared days earlier, and felt its weight settle into my palm like a promise I had made to myself. Opening the door only partway was deliberate. I kept the gap narrow, controlled but open enough to make my meaning unmistakable. They stood so close I could see the shine on Lena's freshly manicured nails and the faint edge of irritation tightening Evelyn's mouth. Neither expression matched the gravity of 10 years. Lena reached casually for her suitcase handle, angling her body toward the threshold, as if walking into my home required nothing more than her decision to do so. My mother positioned herself behind her, assuming I would fall back into the same compliance she once depended on. For a moment, they waited for the version of me they remembered, the one who softened conflict, absorbed blame, and kept the peace for everyone but herself. Instead, I remained still. The folder in my hand stayed closed, but its presence created a boundary neither of them had prepared for. The dynamic shifted in real time. Lena's confidence faltered, barely but visibly. My mother's jaw tightened, the same expression she used when she believed duty outweighed autonomy. Standing my ground felt foreign and astonishingly powerful. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't justify. I let the silence and the narrow doorway speak for me. I held the folder slightly forward, neither offering it nor hiding it, simply acknowledging that it existed. Inside were documents they never expected to confront. A guest license, a notarized no trespass notice, and a detailed ledger of expenses, debts, and emotional manipulations that had shaped the collapse of our family dynamic. They represented a version of me who no longer carried everything quietly, a version who recorded facts instead of absorbing blame. The air between us thickened, dense with a shift they couldn't control. Lena shifted her weight, recalculating. Evelyn's eyes moved from my face, to the folder, to the narrow opening of the door, as if realizing this house was not an extension of her authority. I felt no obligation to ease their discomfort. They waited for permission. I didn't give it. The boundary existed, whether they accepted it or not. Eventually, I stepped back not to invite them inside, but to place the folder on the console table behind me, exactly where it belonged. I positioned the folder deliberately, a quiet declaration that every decision moving forward would be written, measured, and chosen by me alone. The moment held steady, unbroken, each of us sensing how the years apart had reshaped the landscape between us. When the door finally shut behind them, the house didn't feel quieter. It felt defined. Silence had been my normal for years, but this silence was different, sharp-edged, intentional, as though even the walls understood the boundary I had finally drawn. I stood there longer than necessary, letting the adrenaline drain from my fingertips before walking back toward the kitchen. It didn't take long for my phone to vibrate. The timing was predictable, almost rehearsed, the way trouble always traveled through the same well-worn channels. Notifications from cousins I hadn't spoken to in more than a decade appeared one after another. Screenshots flooded in. I didn't open the messages, but the previews were enough. Lena had wasted no time reframing what had happened. Photos of my front porch, cropped carefully to suggest tension, were posted with captions painting her arrival as an act of hope and my refusal as cruelty. She understood the digital stage, as well as she understood our family's emotional terrain. Sympathy rushed toward her with familiar speed. I didn't respond. Engaging would have dragged me back into a script she had spent her life directing. Instead, I opened my laptop, drafted a brief message, and sent it to the relatives still using the same email addresses. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't an apology. It was a boundary written plainly. Communication limited to email, no discussions involving money or housing, no emotional accusations. Anything outside those terms would be ignored. I didn't add justification or soften the phrasing. I simply established the rules I should have set 10 years earlier. More messages came in waves. A few relatives sent paragraphs accusing me of abandoning family values. Someone insisted I had forgotten where I came from. Another said I owed Lena a chance to get back on her feet. And I. Every message carried the same moral weight they had once used to keep me in line, but this time none of it pierced me. They were reenacting a play I no longer agreed to perform in. Not long after, my mother sent a single-line email. No greeting, no punctuation. A message crafted to provoke guilt. You've broken your sister's heart. It carried the same familiar weight she had always relied on. Guilt disguised as concern, obligation framed as virtue. I closed the email without replying. Later that evening, when I saw Evelyn's name appear again in my inbox, I felt nothing sharp or familiar. Just a quiet recognition of the patterns she still believed could influence me. She wrote about sacrifice, about raising 2 daughters alone, about all the years she felt unsupported. Every sentence curved back to the same point, that the stability I had built was something she believed she deserved access to, and denying it was a betrayal of family responsibility. I let the message sit unread. No response would reshape her version of events, and I had finally accepted that her narrative was not mine to fix. Instead, I drafted a separate document outlining the steps I would take if either she or Lena continued to appear uninvited. It wasn't emotional, it was procedural. Contact information for a process server, property law references, instructions for documenting every incident. Creating it felt like reinforcing a foundation I had neglected for far too long. The next morning arrived without incident, but the digital noise didn't stop. Lena posted vague statements about toxic relatives, gathering sympathy from people who knew nothing about either of us. I didn't check her profile, but snippets found their way to me through forwarded messages and notification previews. Her pattern hadn't changed. Position herself as wounded. Imply betrayal. Wait for validation. It had worked for her since adolescence, and she saw no incentive to abandon it now. I spent the day at my kitchen counter, reviewing invoices, updating supply lists, and mapping out deliveries for the week. Work had always steadied me, but now it served an additional purpose, proof that my life existed fully outside their expectations. Everything I had built functioned independently of their approval. As evening settled over the house, the air felt balanced again. Not because the situation had resolved, but because I had reclaimed the space where their assumptions once lived. The documents on my console table remained untouched, ready for the moment they might be necessary. I didn't hope they'd remain unused. Hope had never been part of this equation. What mattered was readiness. Time has its own way of testing boundaries long after the day you draw them. For me, the real test came quietly, not through a dramatic confrontation, but in the simple shape my life held after I chose not to open the door. Mornings still started with production lists and delivery routes. My staff still waited for clear instructions. Ovens still needed preheating. Mixers still needed scraping. Bills still needed paying. Nothing collapsed when I stopped allowing my family's chaos to merge with my schedule. The world stayed upright, and that stability told me more than any apology could. About 3 months after they'd appeared on my porch, the noise finally began to fade. Screenshots dwindled. Emotional posts lost traction. And then, an email from Lena arrived. The email was short and strangely practical. The subject line mentioned work, not heartbreak. The body asked if I knew any places hiring for flexible shifts. There were no accusations tucked between the lines, no attempts to reopen old wounds, no emotional bait designed to pull me back into familiar patterns. I didn't invite her into my bakery. Instead, I replied with a simple list of agencies and local shops I knew were looking for help. Then I closed the message and returned to my spreadsheets without waiting to see what she would do with the information. A few weeks later, Another email appeared this time, with no text at all. Just a single attached photo. Lena, standing in a plain work uniform, an employee badge clipped to her shirt. Fluorescent lights washed the background in the dull glow unique to entry-level service jobs. It was the first image I'd seen of her where she wasn't framed as the center of a tragedy. I saved the file to a folder on my computer and left it there. I didn't interpret it as proof she'd changed. I didn't assign it meaning. I let it stand as quiet evidence that whatever she chose to do from that point forward was her responsibility, not the product of me stepping in to fix or soften her path. Around the 6-month mark, Evelyn reached out again. This time, her message felt stripped of theatrics. She asked if she could see the house once. No sermon woven into the request. No nostalgic recitations of sacrifice. Just a simple question. I answered with clear terms. A specific day, a specific time, and only her. When she arrived, she walked through the house with the tentative air of someone unsure how to categorize what they were seeing. Her gaze lingered on the organized pantry, the neatly stacked baking trays, the absence of clutter that had once swallowed every table in the home we used to share. We sat at the kitchen table while she commented on small, practical things, the sturdiness of the chairs, the depth of the sink, the fact that I owned enough plates for a full table of people who actually chose to be present. She didn't mention the years of silence. I didn't ask for explanations. We both understood that no combination of words could rewrite the pattern that had cast me as the problem and Lena as the story. What remained instead was a brief moment of honest distance, two adults with separate lives meeting in a place that belonged entirely to one of them. When she left, she paused, with her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. It wasn't a claim or a blessing. It felt more like a reluctant acknowledgement that whatever authority she once assumed over my space had quietly expired. Time did what it always does, it kept moving. Nearly a year after I signed the closing papers, I heard from a mutual acquaintance, not family, that Lena had been promoted to shift supervisor. The news was presented casually, like any other workplace update. A mutual acquaintance mentioned it the same way someone might comment on the weather. "Oh, by the way, I heard Lena got promoted." Her online presence had changed too, or so I was told. Fewer vague posts about betrayal. More tired jokes about late shifts, broken espresso machines, and caffeinated survival. The story she fed the world no longer revolved entirely around being wronged. Whether her private narrative about me softened or calcified was something I chose not to track. It was no longer my responsibility to monitor her version of events, or to correct it. Through all of this, I stayed outside their orbit. I didn't resume the role of quiet fixer, financial backup, or emotional sponge. When I did choose to help, it was intentional, handled the same way I approached business decisions, with clarity, limits, and zero ambiguity. Covering a specific bill when it made sense. Sending information someone could use or ignore. But never stepping beyond that line. The rest of my energy went into the people standing in front of me now. Employees who showed up early and told the truth. Neighbors who asked how I was doing without digging for gossip. Friends who cared about my well-being without needing a villain to justify their loyalty. My house slowly became a gathering place. End-of-week potlucks, low-stakes game nights, late-evening debriefs over leftover pastries after brutal rushes. The rooms that once echoed with absence filled with laughter that didn't require me to shrink or absorb damage just to be allowed in the space. The folder of documents near the entryway stayed exactly where I had left it, ready, but untouched. Its existence didn't make me hard. It made me clear. I stopped rehearsing defenses in my head, stopped building imaginary courtrooms where I won arguments no one else would ever hear. I accepted that some people would always cling to a version of me that made their choices easier to live with. My peace no longer depended on them updating that image. It depended on me refusing to trade my sanity for proximity. Looking back, I don't see any of this as a clever revenge arc. There was no cinematic moment where I won. What happened was quieter, and far more important. I stopped letting other people's denial dictate the shape of my days. I learned that love without boundaries is not generosity, it is erosion. I learned that you can wish someone well without giving them a key to your front door, your bank account, or your nervous system. I learned that being called selfish by people who benefit from your exhaustion is not a reliable measure of your worth. If there is anything I hope you carry from this, it's the permission to close doors that only ever open to strip you of yourself. You are allowed to protect the life you built, even when the hands knocking are familiar. You are allowed to choose quiet, honest peace over a performance that keeps everyone else comfortable while you disappear. Thank you for staying with my story wherever you are, whatever the clock reads where you're watching from. If something in this stirred your own reflections about boundaries, you can keep that private, share it with someone you trust, or leave a piece of it here so others feel less alone. However you respond, remember, protecting yourself is not cruelty. It's the beginning of a life that finally makes sense.